Israel has stepped up its attacks in Gaza ahead of the anniversary of the attacks.
Yes, on the one-year anniversary of the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, the conflict in the region shows no sign of stopping. Israel has struck multiple Hezbollah targets in Lebanon's capital city of Beirut in one of the heaviest barrages we've seen yet. And Hezbollah has fired dozens of rockets into northern Israel, killing at least 10 people. Joining me now is global futurist and foreign affairs expert Dr. Keith Suter. Dr. Suter, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Ben.
So over the weekend, we saw heavy missile strikes by Israel. Do you think the Israeli government was thinking about sending a message as we approached the anniversary of October 7, or was this just operational things at work?
I think that the Israeli government is still in a state of shock. The October 7 massacre last year was one of the turning points, I think, in the recent history of the Middle East. It was the biggest infliction of harm on Israelis since the end of the Second World War. And I think Israel is still reeling both from the surprise by which the intelligence agencies were found to have overlooked the emerging threat, and also the amount of people who were killed or captured. So I think Israel is still reeling from this. Meanwhile, the rest of the world looks on in fear of how this violence will escalate. And both sides show no signs of wanting to de-escalate and let the situation cool down.
And now a year on, would you look at that October 7 event as almost like a Pearl Harbor moment for Israel?
Oh, absolutely. Probably even worse than Pearl Harbor in the sense of the shock that the Israelis felt. The Israelis, looking back over their history since World War II, assumed that they would be reasonably safe in Israel. And yet this turned out to be not the case, with over 1,000 people killed and also hostages being taken. And so Hamas, for a short while, had scored a tremendous blow against Israel. And of course, Israel had no choice but to retaliate in force, in full. And that continues to this day.
Yeah, it does indeed. And now, as we've spoken about many times, the retaliation initially was in Gaza, Palestine, as they attempted to really dismantle Hamas. It's now spread to Lebanon. And as I mentioned, we saw very, very heavy missile strikes in Beirut over the weekend. Do we know if those strikes by Israel have been effective so far?
Well, they've certainly been effective in terms of the people they've been able to wipe out. Don't forget that Hezbollah, to the north of Israel in Lebanon, Hezbollah has suffered a number of reversals. One was, of course, the exploding pages, because the Israelis have been so good at tapping into their mobile phone network. They've gone back to an old-fashioned technology, which in turn itself let down the Hezbollah leadership. And then, of course, you get the wiping out of Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, who's been in hiding for such a long time. But the Israelis were able to find him and kill him. So Hezbollah has certainly received a number of blows, but not enough sufficiently to wipe out Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, as we saw over the weekend, Hezbollah fired dozens of rockets into northern Israel. There was about 10 casualties reported by the Israeli government. How effective are those strikes generally? Because we know that Israel has very sophisticated missile defense systems, but the fact that there were so many people killed by these rockets suggests that some do get through if you fire enough.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the problem for the Israelis is that the Iron Dome system could actually be overwhelmed, given the large number of missiles that Hezbollah still have. The Israelis have been very successful in blowing up some of the ammunition dumps that the Hezbollah have. But clearly there is still a risk that the entire system could be overwhelmed by the excessive firing of missiles into Israel. And of course, it's also, again, worth bearing in mind the history here that the Hamas attack took place on October the 7th last year. And then on October the 8th, the following day, Hezbollah decided to join in, saying that they would continue to fight against Israel in the north until Hamas and the warring faction in Gaza stopped the struggle. But in fact, within a year, we've seen how much things have changed within that part of the world, that Hamas have not given in. The struggle still continues in Gaza, although at a lower rate of intensity. And Hezbollah is now on a head-on collision with Israel. And I think that some people are saying, well, this may be an opportunity to reshape the entire Middle East. In other words, to clash head-on with Iran itself, with a view to trying to limit Iran's influence in parts of the Middle East. The last time that we've seen this attempted reshuffle of the Middle East was in 2003 with the American invasion of Iraq, and that did not go well. But that's the feeling that some Israelis feel, that they could do better than the Americans in 2003 and perhaps lead to some overthrow of the Iranian regime. I don't think that's possible, but you never know how weak regimes can be. After all, we were all taken by surprise with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so perhaps the Iranians are being held together by a brutal authoritarian regime, which may start to crumble in the next few months or years.
Yeah, well, it's a dangerous game to play, that's for sure. We saw the power vacuum that the departure of the Americans from Iraq created the environment for Islamic State to rise from the ashes, and that created huge problems around the world. Now, we know that this conflict is spreading in the region. You mentioned Iran, but it's also reverberating around the world. We saw protests right here in Australia over the weekend. But French President Emmanuel Macron has weighed in. He called for weapon exports to Israel to be paused. Let's take a listen to Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu's response.
All civilized countries should be standing firmly by Israel's side. Yet President Macron and some other Western leaders are now calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Shame on them. Is Iran imposing an arms embargo on Hezbollah, on the Houthis, on Hamas, and on its other proxies? Of course not.
What do you make of all that, Keith?
Well, I think that the worry for Israel is not that suddenly they're going to be feeling bereft of French weaponry. I don't think that the halting of supplies of French weaponry to Israel will hurt Israel's military campaign, but it does represent a change in the political alignment, in the sense that the French may well set up a chain reaction of other Western governments saying, yes, it is now becoming too much of a liability to be associated with Israel. We've already seen this happen with some of the British weapon supplies. Britain has decided not to continue to supply weapons. Again, that doesn't have much of a military impact in Israel, but it does have a political impact. And it just shows that some Western governments are becoming a little more hesitant about supporting Israel because of the excessive use of force being used by Israel, which has also, of course, resulted in the Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense being potentially accused of war crimes by an international court in The Hague. So these are going to be real problems for the Israelis, not so much at a military level, but at a political level, because it shows that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated internationally.
Yeah, it's an extremely complex situation with no end in sight. Foreign Affairs expert Dr. Keith Suter, thanks for joining me on the Nightly Five.
Thank you.